Hello and welcome to episode 402 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how are you doing?
I'm great, Andy. I have to say the Rubik's Cube comment or conversation last week obviously sparked some interest because we keep asking for reviews. So please review the podcast. If you haven't reviewed the podcast, please make sure you go and review it because it is free. We put a lot of effort into the podcast, and if you enjoy it, then please leave us 5 stars on whatever podcast app that you use, and we'll read out some of the best ones as we get them. But somebody in their review simply talked about our Rubik's Cube efforts and asked to see it. So we are going to put on our socials Andy and I solving the Rubik's Cube at the fastest pace that we can. So you can see how far we've come from those guys who couldn't even solve it to how quickly we can do it. So you look out for that on our social media.
That's right. We're also doing, the following week, we'll be doing special videos on socials on watching paint dry and all of those kind of things, because that's my wife, I have to say, is completely bored of it by now. And she was bored of it after, I would say, the first 3 days of me getting the reviews.
I find that interesting because my wife's barely noticed. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I think it's probably worse. She's sort of not really engaged with it. My kids seem to be more fascinated by the whole thing than anything else. So what's going to be on this week's podcast, Andy? Leading on from last week, so another link from last week's show, I talked about active funds and how you can find funds that actually do something a bit different. And active share, I talked about that, tracking error, correlations. But I hinted in that show that I would probably lead on and do an additional piece about researching funds that do something different. And so I'm adding some more flesh to those bones by doing something on funds with conviction, and in particular looking about the number of holdings that they have and that concentration of those holdings. So that's going to be the investment piece, which will be the first piece on this week's show. The last part of the podcast, Lauren is going to be coming back on the show. It's been a while since she's been on the show. She's going to be talking about EU roaming charges on mobile phones. There's been some changes to contracts out there, and because obviously Brexit, a lot of providers have reintroduced charges if you use your mobile phone while you're on holiday in the EU, but there are a number that still don't charge, and there's some quite interesting nuances. So Lauren's going to be talking about that, but the other piece, Andy, you're going to be covering regarding self-assessment.
Yeah, that's right. The self-assessment deadline is coming up on midnight, the 31st of January, so just a few days after this podcast is released. So I'm just going to give some quick tips for those that are maybe doing it for the first time or that are still new to it. And there may just be something in there for seasoned self-assessment tax returners for things that they may have forgotten. So yeah, I'll be covering that in the middle piece of the podcast. So Damien, let's move on to the first piece then. And this is kind of taking it on from where we were last week, talking about conviction.
Yeah, so last week I was talking about funds, and if you invest in funds that are classed as active, which means they've got a fund manager who is trying to grow the wealth of their investors, beat the market, and often they don't, they just tend to follow the herd, and that's partly because they are trying not to lose their jobs. But we talked about how you could find funds that are doing something different. And the reason you want to do that, because you might want to try and outperform the market. Of course, they can underperform, but also because you might be thinking you want to do something that's back in a particular sector or market that you are interested in. So they might be investing in something like technology stocks or a particular defensive sector that you are particularly interested in and you want exposure to, even if you are a passive investor with the rest of your portfolio. So this is a piece for everybody, because there are people who invest in both active and passive funds. I personally do that. I'm indifferent to whether they're run by a human or a machine. It's what works that's important. So this week I'm going to take it a little bit further, and I mentioned how you could use performance, tracking error, active share and correlations to find some of these funds that could outperform in certain scenarios or underperform. And go back to listen to that podcast for those insights. This week I want to talk about two things. One of them is to do with the number of holdings. Now, a fund that is being run will typically invest in a range of companies. So I'm only focusing on equity funds here. So I'm talking about Asian ex Japan. This is unit trust sectors. Europe ex UK, so that's another sector. Global equity funds, global equity income funds, North American funds, UK all companies funds, so those are the ones that invest in shares from the UK. They tend to be the biggest companies in the UK. And then the UK equity income funds, those funds that invest in UK shares with a focus on good dividend payers. So you probably find things in there like pharmaceuticals. So looking at all those funds, one of the things is the number of holdings that they have. So if you think that funds, to try and diversify and reduce risk, they will not just back one company, they'll invest in shares of lots of companies. But how many is a lot and how many is a few, as in concentrated? Because there are funds out there. I mentioned one last week, for example, Fundsmith, which is run by Terry Smith, and he runs a very concentrated portfolio which has less than 30 holdings in it. So he only invests in 30 different companies, which is quite low compared to other funds. Now, the thing is, the information about how many holdings that funds hold, so how many companies they invest in, is quite limited. If you look at the fund fact sheets for a fund, they don't typically tell you what the number of holdings are. They will tell you the top 10 holdings by size, the allocation I'm talking about here, how much money they've invested in those holdings. That's shown on the fund fact sheet because they have to do that. Some will tell you the number of holdings in their portfolio, but most don't. Now, it is possible to find the number of holdings if you look at things like Morningstar. They do tell you on some funds the number of holdings that they have. And some platforms, Hargreaves Lansdown, for example, I was looking before this podcast, and they do tell you the number of holdings for some funds, not all funds. And that's the problem. The information isn't widely available out there. And certainly no one, as far as I can tell, has ever gone and looked at what the typical number of holdings is. So that's what I did for 80/20 Investor members as part of a wider research piece that I was doing about the concentration of funds and finding those funds with conviction. So how many holdings is average? So I looked around and there isn't really any information out there that summarizes it. I went through with the information that you could get and took a long time to try and work out a median. So a median is like the mid value. So you could work out an average, but the problem is if you went and looked at, let's say, North American equities and looked at all the funds in that universe of unit trusts, then there was quite a range of funds in that universe. There are some that will have a hell of a lot of holdings. They'd almost be tracking the S&P 500, which has got 500 holdings. There'll be some that will be very concentrated. So to try and minimize the impact of some of the extremes, and don't forget there are multi-manager funds or fund of funds, which are funds that invest in other funds. They'll have very few holdings because they only invest in, say, a dozen different funds. But those funds themselves that they invest in will invest in lots of different companies. So they slightly mislead. So to get rid of that, I looked at the median for each sector. And I'm going to tell you what the median value is. So using this information, if you want to try and tell if a fund is quite concentrated and they're backing their convictions, then look to see if you can find the number of holdings the fund has and compare it to the numbers I'm about to tell you. So Asia ex Japan, the median number of holdings is 60. For Europe ex UK, the median is only 32. For global equities, the median is 47. For global equity income funds, the median, so the number of holdings that they would typically have, is about 67. For North American funds, it's 55. For UK all companies funds, it's about 30, and for UK equity income funds it's about 54. So you can see that it varies quite a bit from sector to sector. So if you look at a global fund, if a fund has only 28 holdings, so that's something like what the Fundsmith equity fund has, you can see that it's quite a concentrated portfolio compared to its peer group. So they're backing their convictions. So you already can see that that fund will do well in certain environments, but if its convictions, whatever it's backing, the companies underperform, then it will have an outsized impact on the fund's performance compared to its peer group. So already take that information and you've learned a hell of a lot more than you'll probably learn other places, because I've never seen somebody actually work out what that median value is for those funds. So go find a fact sheet, go look at Morningstar for the fund that you're interested in, or your platform to see if they tell you how many holdings, and compare that number to what I've just told you, and then you can see if it holds fewer or more than the typical fund from its own sector. But taking it a bit further, I want to give you some insights on global equity funds, and I'm going to take UK all companies funds, because this comes from a piece of research that I did for 80/20 Investor members. I did the complete research on those 7 sectors, but I'm going to mention it for these 2. If you want the full insights, then of course you can take out a free trial if you wish. And what I did is I analysed the holdings for the funds within those sectors, I took out those fund of funds and I took out the multi-manager funds and I took out the passives as well. And I just looked at those funds that were being run actively. Then typically the top one holding, so the biggest holding that a fund would have, accounted for about 8.82% of the fund's assets. If the fund you're looking at, you look at the fund fact sheet, because it will tell you this information, if that number for the biggest holding is above 8.82, you know they're taking a bigger bet on their biggest holding than most of the global equity fund peer group. If you look at the top 5, because again, the fund fact sheets will tell you the top 5 holdings. If that number's above 29.46%, call it 30%, you know that that fund is backing its convictions on those top 5. It really rates them. If you're looking at the top 10, because that's what the fact sheet again will show up to the top 10, if those total holdings are more than 45% of the assets, you know that they are really backing their convictions on those top 10. And so what you're seeing is how concentrated a portfolio is. And I know I keep using the example of Fundsmith Equity only because a lot of people know it because it's a big fund and very popular. If you look at its top 5 and top 10 holdings, the total, they are higher than that average. So it shows you that you can look at that concentration and see whether a fund manager is backing their convictions, even if you don't know how many holdings they have in their entirety. If we jump to the UK all company sector, the numbers are similar, but they are slightly lower. So if a fund from the UK all company sector has, we'll call it 7, if it has more than 7% in its top holding, then it is really backing that conviction. But more importantly, if you look at the top 5 holdings, if they total more than 25.72%, call it 26%, they are backing their top 5 holdings to a greater extent than the other funds that are being run by managers in the UK all company sector. Looking at the top 10, then if they've got more than 42% of their assets in their top 10, then again, they are backing their convictions when it comes to their top 10 holdings. So you can then see if a manager is favouring certain companies and therefore they will have a greater sway on performance than maybe the top 10 holdings of another fund by comparison. So taking that information, I'm not going to go through the other sectors. If you want to see them, then you can, like I say, take a free trial. What I actually did is create a heat map where it was red for each of those top 1, top 5, top 10, top 20, top 50 selections if they were higher than the average for their sector. So the manager was really backing their convictions. It was blue if they were under the average, so they were really not backing their convictions. They were instead picking a wide range of funds and splitting their assets much more evenly across them. So it's a very quick visual way of identifying funds that may be backing their convictions that you might want to go and look at for further investigation.
Okay, so next piece on the podcast then, I'm going to be talking about self-assessment. Now, the deadline for returning your online self-assessment tax return is fast approaching. It's the 31st of January 2023, midnight in fact. And that is, of course, for your tax returns for the 2021-2022 tax year. Now, I'm sure many of you that do tax returns probably know a lot of this information, but there are some nuggets in here that hopefully you didn't know. But the reason I'm bringing it to the pod today is that we've obviously had that period throughout lockdown where a lot of people perhaps were made redundant, started their own business, and we've also had this issue with tax creep where the personal allowances have remained the same for quite a few years now. So where people have got salary increases, they're actually now tipping over thresholds, which is meaning that they now need to do self-assessment tax returns. So let's get through it then. I've written an article which I will link to in the show notes. Firstly, and now it may seem silly, is just question whether you actually do need to do your tax return or not, because many of you have been doing it for many years, may just be in the habit of doing it. But there have been recent rule changes that might mean you no longer need to do it. Your salary may have changed. So just consider whether it is something you actually need to do. So I'll quickly rattle off a few of the reasons why you may need to submit a self-assessment tax return. So if you've earned more than 100,000 in taxable income in the tax year 2021-2022, you will need to do one, and that's to do with your personal allowance. I will actually cover that in a bit more detail later on. If you are self-employed, of course, during the tax year of 2021-22 and you earn more than £1,000, you'll need to do one. If you claimed a grant or support payments for COVID-19 in the tax year 2021-22, you'll have to fill in a self-assessment tax return for those reasons. If you were employed in the tax year 2021-22 and claimed business expenses in excess of £2,500, that's another reason why you'll need to do one. And another reason, which is worth mentioning again, and I highlight this for people who have had salary rises in recent couple of years and who have maybe tipped over the threshold of earning £50,000 per year or more. If you do earn that amount and you do receive child benefit, or your partner does, you will need to do a self-assessment tax return because you may be required to pay what's called a high income child benefit charge. Put simply, that means you may need to pay some of your child benefit back. And of course, if you're a higher rate taxpayer or an additional rate taxpayer, you would want to be doing a self-assessment tax return every year anyway, to ensure that you're getting your full tax relief on your pension contributions. That is your entitlement. So you definitely make sure you do that. Because, well, I'm sure most of you know, when you do your pension contributions, your pension provider will automatically get the basic pension tax relief on your behalf. But if you're a higher rate or additional rate taxpayer, it's up to you to claim the extra back. The next tip that I've done on the article is really all about allowing enough time to make sure that you can gather the information together that you need, because there's nothing more frustrating than sitting down to do your tax return and thinking, right, I'm going to nail this. And then you find out, oh, I haven't got that pay slip, or where's that P60 saved? And so you start the process, then you have to save it and log off and try and get that sort of momentum to get back online to finishing it. You might well find that that is the thing that means that you end up filing late, because it's getting that motivation to get doing it. So actually, if you can prepare and get everything in advance, honestly, it will make the whole process feel so much smoother. Another few tips on that to try and make that process as smooth as possible. Check ahead of time to make sure that you know your UTR, which is your unique tax reference. Damien, I'm sure you've been in the same situation as me before. When you struggle to find that, you then have to request passwords and replacement codes. It becomes ever so tricky, and if you're on a deadline, that is an absolute nightmare. To get that ahead of time. Obviously, this isn't one for this year because we are just a few days from it, but if you find yourself in this situation every year where you find yourself a bit muddled and thinking, oh, I've got to get organized, do consider one of those online business accounting software packages. There are lots available. Sage does a version, Xero, QuickBooks. For just a few pounds a month, it could save you a hell of a lot of hassle. So yeah, if you're in this predicament every year and you're thinking, I need to save myself some time, go ahead and look at those. We've got an article on the website. I'll link to it in the show notes. And also, just finally on this one, HMRC does have an app. Not a lot of people know that. So it works very similar to the website. You can log in, you can see all your documents and information. You can make your self-assessment payment through the app. You can track forms and letters that you've sent to them, claim refunds, update your postal address. It's pretty good. It's not perfect like most things, but it is pretty good. So consider getting the app and downloading it on your phone. If not for this year, for next year. The next tip I want to cover is making sure that you use up all of your allowable expenses. And not all of them are immediately obvious. So do take the time to make sure that you're claiming all of, and what I would say is legitimate expenses. And by that, I mean, make sure that it is something that you actually can claim for and have used legitimately. I'll cover off a few of these because I know when I've done my own tax returns, I'm looking here and thinking, wow, I've actually missed an opportunity where I could have offset some of my earnings. So bank charges can be offset as an allowable expense. Business mileage, you probably know that already, but you can claim up to 45p for every business mile travelled up to 10,000 miles, and then 25p per mile for anything over 10,000 miles. Charitable donations, some insurance premiums can also be offset as well. So things like professional indemnity insurance, business clothes. So if your business requires you to wear a uniform, any laundry of those business clothes can be offset as well. Marketing costs, that's a given. And also bad debt. And bad debt is essentially revenue that you are planning on not receiving, such as long-standing unpaid invoices. They can actually put through as allowable expenses as well. And so on the next tip then, we're talking about allowable expenses. Use up any unused allowances from previous tax years. Now, there are certain things that you can put through on your tax return. If you haven't used up your previous year's allowance, you can actually go back a number of years. And so you should check to see if you have any unused allowances from previous tax years, as you may well be entitled to a rebate. So while the deadline for submitting the 2021-22 tax year is the 31st of January 2023, it is also the deadline for making amendments to your 2020-2021 self-assessment, assuming you did one in the previous year. And so it's worth double checking, for example, if you claimed the working from home allowance. And that's an allowance where you can claim for increased costs of things like gas and electricity while working from home. So again, check your allowances that you're able to put through for previous tax years. And we mentioned the additional tax relief on your pension contributions. You can actually do the same with your pension contributions as well, as you can carry forward some of your pension allowance from previous tax years. And again, I've linked to an article that talks all about exactly what that is and how it works. And I'll put details of that in the show notes as well. The next section on the article that I've done is all about understanding whether your earnings have increased and what that could actually mean in terms of submitting a self-assessment tax return. So this is just a reminder really that there are certain allowances for certain types of earnings and income that you'll need to be aware of. And certainly where things like where interest rates have improved in the last year or so, you may well find that you're creeping close to or even tipping over certain allowances. So specifically there, I'm talking about savings and investments. There is a personal savings allowance of up to £1,000 for basic tax rate payers. So that means you can earn up to £1,000 in income from your savings and investments if you're a basic rate taxpayer without having to pay any tax. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, that allowance is reduced to £500. And for additional rate taxpayers, they actually have no allowance at all. You'll have to pay tax on all of your earnings from savings and investments. So do check to see if you've got investments, how much you've earned in interest, and whether you'll need to put that on your tax return this year. On that same theme, then you've got property rental income. There is a property allowance of £1,000 for individuals who receive income from land or property. So again, if you've put up rent and you've got additional rental income, you might need to consider whether that needs to go on your tax return this year.
Talking of income from renting, don't forget there's a rent a room relief, which is if you rent a room out in your house, for example, you can earn up to £7,500 a year and you don't have to pay tax on it. You don't have to actually submit a tax return for that either, as long as you're under that level.
In terms of any other income, there is a trading allowance of £1,000, which allows individuals to earn up to £1,000 a year. And that's for things like, buying and selling, say, on eBay, or if you've got hobbies and you sell things at the weekend, you can earn up to £1,000 a year without any trouble. But if you are earning over that, then you will need to go and start submitting an online self-assessment tax return. And we touched on it earlier. If your salary is over £100,000 per year, then you are required to complete a self-assessment tax return so that your personal allowance can be adjusted accordingly, because HMRC rules state that those earning over 100,000 will have their personal allowance reduced by £1 for every £2 that their adjusted net income is above £100,000. Basically what that means is after you earn £100,000, there's a taper, and if you earn over 125,140, you essentially lose all of your personal allowance. And just a couple of final bits to finish off this piece. I'm aware that it's quite a lengthy piece, but there's much more information on the article that I haven't covered in detail, so make sure you do check it out. So finally then, understanding how and when to pay your tax bill. It can be confusing to some. Essentially what you need to remember is the rules have been tightened this year. In the last couple of years, we've kind of had it a little bit easy. HMRC have been a little bit lenient in regards to fines and when you file your tax return. There's no leniency this year. You have to hit that deadline of midnight on the 31st of January. If you miss it and don't file your return, there is an immediate £100 fine that will be slapped on your account, and there are additional fines which I'll talk about in just a second. And for those that are doing their first self-assessment, just be aware. Now this might sound really obvious for those that do it year after year, but when I did my first one, I've actually spoken to Justin at work when he did his first one. We both had the same issue. We kind of assumed that once you go through the form, which is fairly lengthy when you start out, but you do get used to it, and you click the submit button, because you've had to put in your bank details and bits and pieces, because you have to do that because in case there's a rebate, there's a section where you put in your bank details. You assume that the click and submit is actually you saying go ahead and take the money. It isn't. You have to then use that reference and go into a separate part of the website and then go and submit how you wish to pay. And there's different options. You can do it by card, bank transfer, direct debit, etc. So just a quick tip for the newbies. It's not as simple as click and submit. Make sure that you go then and look where you need to pay it, because you don't want to be issued with a fine. And so while we're talking about fines, then let's move on to that. So there's £100 fine if you submit your return late. There are additional fines and penalties over and above that. And so if you fail to file your return for a further 3 months, you will then start to receive £10 daily penalties, up to a potential total of £900. And then after 6 months, if you still haven't filed your return, you'll be required to pay an additional penalty of 5% of the tax due, or £300, whichever is greater. And then after 12 months, if you still haven't filed it, an additional penalty of 5% of the tax due will be applied, or £300, whichever is greater. Essentially what that means is when you look at all those fines together, if you don't file your return for, let's say, 12 months, it's over £1,500 worth of fines. Now that is just fines for not returning. That's not even take into account the tax that you actually owe them as well. So that, I mean, these fines, they're fines on fines, if you like. So we've covered the fines on not filing your return. And so if you miss the deadline for your tax payment, then you are charged interest from the day that it becomes due. And the rate is currently 6%, and it is charged in line with the Bank of England base rates. That percentage does actually change over time depending on the Bank of England base rate. But in addition to that, HMRC also applies penalties after 30 days. For example, a penalty of 5% of the tax due, and then after 6 months an additional penalty of 5% of the tax due, and after 12 months an additional penalty of 5% of the tax due. So there are charges on charges there, so just be mindful. You want to get that tax bill paid as soon as you can. Now, that is obviously quite stressful, and especially those who are perhaps having cash flow issues. There are things you can do if you know that you're going to be struggling to pay your tax bill. First of all, I would urge you to have a look at the article that I've done, or go onto HMRC and search time to pay. It's an arrangement that HMRC will allow you to do, that if you owe less than £30,000 in tax and you are willing to complete the repayments within 12 months and you have no other debts with HMRC, they'll allow you effectively to work out a payment plan with them where you can pay in regular instalments. You'll need to share additional information, things like your earnings, your outgoings, and how much you're willing to repay each month, a bit like a debt repayment plan, but it's not as serious as that, and it is an arrangement with HMRC, because let's think about it. HMRC want to recover the money. They don't really want to be in the business of charging people interest and penalties if they can avoid it. So make sure that you check that out. And so there we go, a quick whistle stop tour of self-assessment tax returns. I'm sorry if there's people out there that don't have one, but you never know.
It is a good evergreen piece as well, Andy, though, I have to say, because there's a lot of information in there that you can come back to in the future. So I think it was very good. One thing I will throw in there as well is payments on account, because let's say you're about to pay your tax bill on the 31st of January, you also have to pay the payment on account, which relates to the earnings for this current year as we make this podcast. That would be in relation to what Andy was talking about, the 2022-23 tax year. Because what HMRC are trying to do, it really is get people who are self-employed, who fill out tax returns, to pay their tax every 6 months. And really, if you get to the tax return the next year, you should be all kind of square. That's the theory behind it. But what it means is some people might work out their tax return for the previous tax year, but then have a payment on account they weren't quite expecting, which is quite high. Technically, you can request to reduce your payment on account. So you can reduce it down to a level that you deem is reasonable if you think your earnings aren't going to be as great as the previous year, because that payment on account will be influenced by your previous earnings. So if you earned a lot in a given year, your payment on account that you'll have to pay, which is in addition to the tax payment you're going to pay on the 31st of January, you're going to pay one on the 31st of July, that will broadly, it's me putting my fingers in the air, be about half your tax bill for any given year. You can request to have it reduced, so it's not so much if you can't afford to pay so much in one go, but you will when you get to do your tax return for the year that those payments on the account would relate to. You'll have to end up paying interest if there turns out to be more tax than the total of those payments on the account. So again, you can read more on Andy's article about all this kind of stuff, but there are options and you can search around that and speak to an accountant. So the last piece on the podcast this week is relating to EU roaming charges on mobile phones. So if you remember, it used to be the case that most mobile phone operators used to include phone calls, text messages and data usage if you were in the EU on holiday. So, there are nuances between the different providers, but generally speaking, you could use your phone abroad as if you were at home. Well, Lauren has produced a roundup this week of what the latest state of play is with different mobile providers, because there have been changes with a number of them reintroducing charges if you're going to use your phone abroad. So Lauren, welcome back to this show. So what is the current state of play with regard to EU roaming and mobile phone operators?
Yeah, so following on from the Brexit trade deal in December 2020, the ban on additional roaming charges for UK network providers no longer applies, which now means that providers can reintroduce EU roaming charges. Now, this piece on the podcast is inspired by a news article I wrote this week about Tesco Mobile. Now, they're one of the latest providers to reintroduce the EU roaming charges. And I'm just going to talk you through the different providers that charge for roaming in the EU, as well as the providers that don't charge you. So if you are with a provider that does charge you for EU roaming and you often travel to the EU, then you may wish to switch network providers. So as Damien briefly said, data roaming or roaming is when you use your phone on a network that isn't your current provider, e.g. when you are abroad. So you're effectively using another network to communicate, and that usually means there's an additional cost involved. So because of this is why some network providers are now reintroducing their roaming charges for us when we travel abroad. Now, with some network providers, this is covered by your inclusive allowance, so your allowance that you have in your pay monthly contracts, for example. And some of them have different policies, such as Roam Like Home, where you can go abroad to certain EU countries and use your phone as if you were in the UK. Now, in this piece, I'm exclusively focusing on EU roaming charges, but if you are travelling further afield this year, then you will need to check with your provider on the roaming costs at your destination, because some providers, such as Three, Vodafone, EE and O2, either have additional packages or have additional roaming charges for some customers if you are travelling outside of the EU. Okay, so there are a number of mobile phone providers that have reintroduced EU roaming charges, and a number of these network providers do allow you to use your current monthly plan abroad, but you do have to pay an additional roaming cost. So this could be a package that is, for example, around £2 a day, or you may be able to purchase a set pass, which allows you to use your UK allowance abroad for a set amount of time, which will save you money. One thing that I do have to caveat here is that if you do have a contract where you have capped the allowance, you will have to look into lifting this before you leave the UK. So, for example, I've capped my monthly phone bill so that I can't spend anything more than the £13 a month I pay. So if I wanted to go abroad and pay £2 a day to access my roaming abroad, then I will have to lift this before I leave the UK. Otherwise, my monthly contract will be capped and I won't be able to spend while I'm abroad. So EE, Sky Mobile, Tesco Mobile, Three, Vodafone and Voxy all charge when roaming in the EU. If you are an EE customer and you took out your plan on or after the 7th of July 2021, you will be affected by these charges. Sky Mobile and Voxy customers, they are all affected by the EU roaming charges, so it doesn't matter when you took out your contract. If you are a Tesco Mobile customer, you will be affected from late spring 2023. So you have a few months left if you are going away to the EU before that time, where you will be able to benefit from fee-free roaming charges. And if you were a customer that joined or upgraded on or after the 16th of June 2022, then you will be affected by these new EU roaming charges. If you are a Three customer and you upgraded on or after the 1st of October 2021, you will also be affected by the EU roaming charges. And finally, if you are a Vodafone customer and you took out a contract or renewed on the 11th of August 2021, you will also be affected unless you are on one of its extra plans with 4 extra benefits.
Great. So those are the mobile operators that are charging their customers, or most of their customers, for using their phone while abroad in the EU. What about those who are still keeping it free to use your phone in the EU?
Yes. So if you are an Asda Mobile, BT Mobile, giffgaff, ID Mobile, O2, Plusnet, Talk Mobile or Virgin Mobile customer, then you can still currently use your phone abroad in the EU at no extra cost. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that some of these have limits or fair usage limits, and all of these limits will be provided in the article on the Money to the Masses website. So they will go into detail of how much you can spend and use on data abroad before it will be capped. And then if you go over these fair use limits or your plan limits, then you will be charged an additional fee. But these are quite generous fees, and a lot of them are only charging you UK standard plan fees for going over your limits. One thing to note as well is if you are a Virgin Mobile customer, you are going to be transferred over to the O2 network throughout 2023. And we have more on this on a news article on the Money to the Masses website. So that is something to bear in mind.
So, as you say there, it is possible to use your phone within your plan limits for that last list that you've just mentioned. But you did actually uncover some interesting things. One that's impacted me, actually, because there are people out there who pick their network because it's the only network that offers them coverage where they might live or work, for example. So they don't have a lot of choice because they live in a bit of a black spot. But there are some quirks, aren't there, where some providers who charge, for example, EE when you're abroad in the EU now. But if you use another provider, which is basically running on the EE network, you won't be charged.
Yeah, so some of the smaller providers, it's called piggybacking. They piggyback off of a bigger provider's network. So, for example, PlusNet and BT Mobile, they piggyback off of the EE network. So if you, like you say, get good EE coverage at your home, you could potentially switch to a PlusNet mobile phone contract where you are able to spend abroad in the EU at no extra cost. So that's something to consider. And if that is something that you wanted to do, we have a really handy article on the Money to the Masses website, which tells you how you can switch mobile provider with just a text message. So you don't have to go through the rigmarole of ringing up the provider, trying to get persuaded to stay and feeling guilty for leaving. So that's an interesting article to look at. So just to summarize and finish, if you are stuck in a contract with your network provider and you are worried about traveling abroad and you don't want to be charged for data roaming, there are a few things that you can actually do that can help you to save money. So one of the key things to do is turn data roaming off before you arrive. If you don't want to be charged, you don't want to pay £2 per day to use your monthly contract benefits abroad, then go into your mobile phone settings and mobile data and turn off data roaming before you arrive in the country. Also, whenever you can connect to Wi-Fi, that means that you aren't going to use any data on your phone, and you can also make calls via social networks such as Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp. Another tip is to download content ahead of time. Ensure you download any TV, films or music so that you can listen or watch content without an internet connection. And finally, wherever you go, you may be able to purchase a local pay-as-you-go SIM. So you need to check that your phone and the local SIM card are compatible, but this will allow you to access data when out and about at a fraction of the cost potentially of your UK mobile network provider.
So, as Laura mentioned at the top of her piece, that this came from an article on the Money to the Masses website. We've put a link in the notes of this show and on the article that relates to this episode on the Money to the Masses website, where you'll find all of the details of all of the providers who do charge, when they charge, those who don't, those who piggyback, and the additional costs if you want to buy add-ons. So all the information is in there. So thanks, Lauren. So Andy, bring you back in. That is it for this week. I think we're done. We've packed quite a bit into that show.
That's it. So please do get in touch and use your way if you've got any questions at all, or if you've got suggestions for what we could cover in upcoming future episodes of the Money to the Masses podcast. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com, or of course Andy at moneytothemasses.com. And of course you can contact us through our socials, and you can check out our YouTube channel as always. So that's it, Damien. We are done. Until next time.
Until next time.